Well, hello, everyone. Welcome again to HCM Impact, Human Capital Management Impact, also known as Raise the Tide. My name is Brad Boyson, joining you from Dubai. And as we've done over these past few weeks, we bring in subject matter experts from around the world, people who have been involved in the development of ISO standards, human capital management standards, and the whole suite of TC 260 work. Today, we're joined by a very special guest joining us from Pakistan, a good friend of mine, Zahid Mubarik. Zahid, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brad, for the opportunity.
No, our pleasure, our honor. And I'm going to share with you something that came up in one of the other interviews because, and I mean it in the most positive way. I gave you a nickname. I called you the Kevin Bacon of this project. And I don't know if you know the reference to this, but in the US, one of the actors, Kevin Bacon, there's a sort of a game of connect the dots. And there's a theory that everyone in Hollywood can be connected to Kevin Bacon with 6 degrees of separation. And it's the same with this project. Everyone in this project can be connected to Zahid Mubarik, maybe within 2 or 3 degrees of separation. So take that as a compliment. You've done so much for this project over so many years, and on behalf of everyone involved, I thank you personally on behalf of them.
You're most welcome, and thanks for this your kind compliments. I'm happy to have this compliment from your side.
Well, and here's the thing. For the 7 degrees of separation of people who might not know who you are, give us your introduction about yourself and how you became involved in this project.
Wonderful. So you know that I'm leading my own company, the HR Metrics, and this company was created on the philosophy of developing the connections, the verifiable connections between the human capital performance and the organization performance. And I remember when I was creating this company, many people said that it's a very narrow focused company, but I knew what I was aiming to do. So in fact, I was inspired with the vision of the founder of the analytics. His name was Jack Fizzens. He talked about the analytics and the metrics in 1970. So I wanted to do something non-traditional, unconventional. And that was the reason that I came up with this idea of the HR metrics. And fortunately, when I created my organization, it was the first one in the Asia to talk about the data metrics and the analytics. So in that context, fortunately, I got in contact with the people who had really an appetite for the analytics. So in the first instance, I became member of the special expertise panel in the SHRM USA on the HR data analytics. And the role of the expertise panel was to develop the future trends. So that was a good, I think, stepping stone for me. Subsequently, I initiated a lot of things at my end, for example, doing a research, because many things that in our daily life we don't have a reference point, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, what is the cutoff points. So I did benchmarking within my own company. I tried to connect with the people across the world. And in this process, fortunately, when I started this journey of developing standards, so I was the first member from the Asia, where the other countries like the US, Germany, France, Netherlands, Austria, Portugal, Sweden, Norway. So total there were 11 countries, and I was one of the 11 pioneer members of the TC 260. So that's, I think, about myself.
Wonderful, wonderful. And here's just a follow-up on that. I mean, that was, a decade ago. Yes. What did you see at that time that perhaps other people didn't see, Zahid? Like, what got you involved then rather than now when it's starting to get a lot more attention?
So I think I read somewhere that it's not what you do, but how do you do? I see a lot of people doing HR management, but not according to the requirement. I mean, your stakeholders. So once I was making an entry to this profession, I tell you something very interesting. I served more than 20 years in the public sector. And
Okay.
when I wanted to join the private sector, I tried to understand what it requires to be a professional. For example, the accounting professional, the IT professional, the marketing professional, HR professional. So everybody whom I consulted uh, told me some barriers to the entry to a profession. For example, to be an accountant, you need a chartered accountancy. To be an IT professional, you need some kind of qualification. And one of the professions which everybody says that you can easily join without any credentials is the HR profession. So that was a challenge that I created myself, that what kind of profession it is, where there's no barrier to the entry. So there's no barrier. You cannot imagine the kind of, the outcome from this profession. So I really wanted to do something different, which makes the HR people distinguished in terms of their contribution and their value addition to the organization. And this is what is the need of I think now the time is proving that the business people, the stakeholders, the regulators, they want something measurable. They want something tangible. They want something understandable, I would say. So in that context, I really wanted to add value to this process of evidence-based management in the HR systems.
Yeah, I identify with what you say in terms of, okay, if you want to do this, you have to do this. If you want to do this, you have to do this. But if you want to work in HR, go ahead. It's open season. You just have to apply for a job. If someone hires you, you're an HR professional, and it's nice to see these things changing, hopefully for the better. Now, you're involved in also developing certifications related to this standard. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in sort of advancing this project.
So after this, the ISO standards have been published, and you know that by now more than 24 standards have been published. So we have been actively involved in developing the overall standards, and particularly the data analytics standards, the 30414, which is one of them, not all of them. So whenever a standard is published, there's always an opportunity to develop the organizations, to develop the people, because you need to use that standards to add value in the community or for which this standard is meant. So on that front, I started a process of developing the certifications in the light of the requirements, because ISO also has requirements for the organizations who want to come up with a certification. So by meeting those requirements, we were able to create the process and the structures around that. And by now we are, I think, proud to say that we have the highest number of the certified professionals around the world, 32 people, with a good concentration from Japan, Europe, Middle East, and the Asia. So we were able to develop those people around the 3041 certification, with the purpose that there should be a proper learning mechanism as well as the validation mechanism. So how somebody can get an indicator that he or she has met the requirements of being called a qualified professional. And then within that framework, we created different layers in terms of eligibility, in terms of testing the knowledge, in terms of creating a scenario where they can apply that knowledge, and finally judgment test, how the people can use that knowledge to solve the business issues. So this is the overall framework around which we created the certification and have developed, I think, 32 professionals so far, in the process of doing more.
And when you're talking to individuals who may not be aware of this project, or even they may be a bit, hesitant, maybe they're choosing between different educational and investment options in their professional development, how do you present this particular niche, this particular certification? What is, and maybe the follow-up to that is, how do you articulate the benefit or ROI to them in investing in this?
So in my approach, I do not emphasize or do not pitch somebody with a certification. My unique selling proposition with the people is that identify in the first instance the purpose of your existence and the purpose of your job. What is the
Okay.
purpose of your, are you doing a job? Are you doing it with certain purpose? And if you have a certain purpose, whether you call it the goal or the purpose or the objective, that's a secondary thing. If you have any purpose, then it's very important, rather critical, to have some kind of baseline or the measurement to define where do you stand and where do you want to go. Because not having a purpose, I think, is suicidal. And even if you have a purpose and you don't have the opportunity or the instrument to measure, then you would not be able to demonstrate somebody what is your value addition. So in that context, the people, I think they buy this idea. And whatever the portfolio they have, for example, they are in the maybe operational role or the strategic role, they always have a purpose, the stated purpose. And I think the 30414 within the HR context is a very useful instrument. I don't call it the perfect instrument, but a useful instrument to relate where do you stand and where do you want to go.
Very nice. And probably a lot like myself, you've probably encountered some people who, when you introduce this idea, they push back, or they're at it, you know, to say it nicely, they're a bit hesitant to see the value. What's the most, it's a double-ended question, but what's the most common pushback you get from the market, and how do you address that pushback? You know, either you define a market individually or maybe by decision makers.
I think still now I have involved the decision makers as a role models, because the decision makers don't have to certify themselves. But obviously, for example, you have a CEO
Right.
and who strongly believes and writes and speaks about the value of ethics. So,
Okay.
right. So you engage that particular CEO. He may not be aware of the ethics metrics, but he's a strong proponent of the, for example, the trust or anything. And when you engage those people as a role modeling and tell, you know, look, this is what you think is important, and here is what I have in terms of how to measure what you think is important. For example, you won't find anybody saying that capacity building is not important. Everybody would say, but you tell them capacity building leading to what, and what is your leadership trust ratio? What is your succession readiness ratio? So in that context, in a deciphered language, in a non-technical way, in the first instance, they buy the idea that it's definitely there's a level of difficulty involved in terms of, you know, buying decisions from the cost perspective, from the time commitment perspective, and also sometimes the fear that they may not qualify. But the thing is that in the first instance, they need to buy it as a concept, and then rest of the things are the modalities.
And how about people who will say things like, and again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you haven't heard before, but some people will say either work around the world is so different that it can't be standardized, or in complement to that, you know, what we do wherever we are is, you know, in a unique industry, or, you know, to standardize things is moving away from the human practice of HR. How do you address those
I think
resistance points?
this is the most common questions, particularly for the people who want to, you know, who are not comfortable with this idea. So my answer is very clear. I always tell them in the first instance that standards does not mean a standardization in the procedures. You're talking about the expectations of the stakeholders, and it gives you a lot of freedom to do the things the way you want to do it. There's no best way of doing the thing. So you're not purely becoming a prisoner of the process. Process is always flexible, but the guidelines is there according to the latest situation, but the outcomes are very obvious. You have to focus more on the outcomes, number one. Number two, the simple examples which exist around the world. For example, I asked them that you have so many people with the different backgrounds, ethnicity, regions, and everybody has got own structure of their bodies. But then why do we have a uniformity in from the cholesterol and the blood pressure around the world? Because you're not standardizing the people, but you're trying to look at, you know, how to measure what is acceptable. So in that context, if you are able to regulate a very complex profession like medical, where every human being is different, so what's the problem in quantifying the performance of the human being? That should not be an issue. So usually the question comes that the cultures are different. So this standard gives you the opportunity to measure the culture, and there are certain guidelines, but if you can have some other thing to do it, and you are in a position to measure, by all means you can do it. But this is not the reason for not doing the things. If you're saying that culture is important, you have to come up with some kind of framework to measure.
Zahid, do you have an example of maybe one of the success stories of one of your students or even yourself where you can share, because it's such a new thing, standards in human resources, human capital is a relatively new initiative. And I think one of the best things that, given a leader in this that you are, maybe some of the stories of your success or maybe some of your students' success that you could share with us.
So one of the quite recent information that I got from one of my students, who is a general manager in an energy company, he told me that the organization was in a process of acquiring another company, and he was involved in the due diligence process. And he was of the view that traditionally in the due diligence, everything is numeric, except for the HR, where the numerics are only involved in the headcount or on account of compensation. But other important things like as you already mentioned, the culture, your leadership, your capacity building of the people, your talent pipeline. So he was able to add a lot of value in terms of the quantification of the various aspects of the human capital management by using the 30414. And he said that it has been a great help by using 30414. We are also reaching out to the other students, because whosoever has graduated, we have a mechanism of recording their impact stories. And we ask them, have you moved the needle? So we are reaching out to them as to how they've been able to add value in their organizations, in their community, in their department. And we're hoping to have more stories. One thing on the top of it, which is not related to 30414, but I provided consulting to an organization in 2012. That was much before 30414.
Yes.
And we were able to develop, first of all, identify some of the critical metrics in the organization, and then track those metrics with the organizational productivity. They were in the polymer business, and financial performance. And I can share the annual report of the organization, because we raised the level of the HR contribution to an extent that was published in the annual report. So you would agree that the annual report, every department always features their accomplishments toward the organization performance, but only the HR, where only some kind of the trainings or the tracking or the birthday, etc., are shown. So we were able to depict some of the key metrics in the annual report, and that was I think, fortunately, I think the CHRO at that point of time is now the CEO of that company. I think this is the biggest. Yeah.
That's a great story. And, I think on a small level, I think back to my own career where I've used a metric to leverage a practice that I felt was in the organization's best interest. It's so much easier than trying to convince people based on, hey, I'm the head of HR. Hey, can't you see how, culturally aware I am? Can't you see how smart I am? Can't you see how educated I am? All these factors that are personal. When you take all of that personal stuff out and you focus on, the mutual goals, and you're able to present sort of a before and after in an objective way, I don't think a huge percent of HR people really appreciate the value and power of doing that. But let me follow up on a question based on the example you just gave, because you gave an example before these ISO standards were published. So I guess if I'm trying to sort of question the value of these ISO standards, what's been added because the ISO standards have been published? What's changed? Why can't I just do metrics before? And what's different now? What's changed?
Before, obviously, there was also an opportunity, but it was not a consistent framework around the globe. And I think now the marketing and the recognition opportunity for the organization is much higher, because in the recent past, you have seen the two global organizations, the Deutsche Bank and one of the subsidiary DWS have been certified, and you can see the amount of the global recognition that they have enjoyed. I'm sure the investors worldwide also now value. So this gives them an added opportunity, but it does not mean that this opportunity did not exist in the past. I want to tell you something interesting. As a part of my consulting, I was working with the two subsidiaries. And once we were in a process of conducting a diagnostic assessment, we came across some of the information which was not very positive. So one of the CHRO said that, if this information goes to my board and they find all these gray areas, I'll go home, because everything would be in the limelight. X-ray is just like a matrix, is just like an X-ray. It cannot hide anything. It truly reveals. And the interesting part, another CHRO of the CHRO of this sister subsidiary had a similar situation, and on his face, he told me that, please include my information for my board of directors. I want to take it to them. So I politely asked him, I can understand the reason with the previous, your fellow, for hiding the information, but you tell me the reason, why do you want to take the weak metrics to the board? He said, unless I don't tell them the weak areas, how I'm going to demonstrate my strength, which I want to, have in this company. So they must know the baseline. I would add value, and I'll prove and demonstrate my value contribution. And without naming, let me tell you, at this stage, if I look back in the journey, the gentleman who was hesitant, who was not comfortable with acknowledging the transparency, ultimately went home, and the gentleman who showed a courage to take forward the weakness and convert into a strength became a CEO of the company. So this I think, in the nutshell, I look back and I see that what is the value of being transparent, and what's the value of having the evidence-based management in your organization. Because it's just like if somebody is sick and know that your blood pressure, your cholesterol or sugar level is high, but even if you try to hide it, you imagine the consequences. So hiding is not the solution. Reality is reality, and this 30414, I think, provides you good opportunity to determine where do you stand and where do you want to go.
Well, and I love the word you used before, consistency too. I told the story in one of the previous discussions that I was in a government entity a few years ago, and they came up to me and asked for advice because they said they're converting all of their entities to use the same IT system, and they've discovered they're all using different measures and metrics. And without that standard as a benchmark, what's to stop people from using their own? And it's not inherently a bad thing, because it's like when you look at the science of measuring, if you're off by a consistent percentage, you still gather the information of the trend. So it's better than nothing. But once you've got the consistency between organizations externally, there's a whole new opportunity, especially for people who are, like the example you just gave, people who are confident in their abilities, people who want to demonstrate the value that they add. Said another way is that, again, consistent with your example, there are unfortunately a lot of people who've been able to hide behind noise. And when you're measuring things in a more objective way, internally and externally, it pulls away sort of the noise and exposes a bit more truth and reality. And I think that's, again, a large part of the reason why there's some resistance to this type of movement, which people like you and I would say is net positive. Well, it's net positive for like-minded people.
True.
If someone was, not fortunate enough to be able to, take a course through someone like yourself or other learning experiences, or perhaps they're quite early on in their career, they're human capital, they could be in HR, maybe they're in finance, and they want to learn more about what you've been talking about the standard, or get involved and acquire some skills and abilities related to applying the standard. Do you have any advice for them?
I think in the first instance, from the understanding point of view, the source website is the number one thing, where this is a public document, they can always buy, they can retrieve it, understand, right? But they definitely should expect a level of difficulty, because metrics is not just the putting two bit of information in the form of a numerator and denominator and come out. The important thing is to look at the information in a certain context. So interesting thing over here, I want to share with you that while I was in the TC260 at two occasions, I served as the chair of the working groups for developing the HR metric standards. So during that time frame, I was able to suggest, and fortunately, the TC260 agreed, and we made it as a part of the structure, that previously there was no consistent framework for the metric. So people were making metric the way they understood. So I came up with the idea that when we use the word metric, we should have a defined structure that should include the general definition, the purpose, the formula, the contextual factors, predictive factors, and one example. So that if somebody is able to look at these things, should have a clear idea about it. And now that structure was followed, and that is being used in the technical specification documents, which basically explain. So right. That ambiguity has been, I think, resolved to a greater extent. But of course, that thing is not a substitute for the discussions which promote more clarity, which is a good way of looking at how the other people do it. But it's that in any way, that there's no obstacle. People can always buy the document, they can learn the document. For doing I think certification, that is where they have to appear in a certain test, and then they get themselves qualified. Otherwise, learning is not an obstacle at the moment with the publication of the technical specification documents, which are, you can say, an annex document to the 30414.
And where do you see the near future? What's your vision of success, perhaps, 2 years from now? If you and I were to get together and hopefully it's not video, if it doesn't have to be, can be face to face, and we were reflecting upon the success of the past 2 years, what would have happened in these 2021, 2022 period that would demonstrate success to you?
So I think I would like to answer your question with some of the emerging developments.
Absolutely,
number one, that you see the World Economic Forum is a very powerful organization, and they have the presence of the international business councils and the chairs of the 4 leading audit firms. The most recent development was in the US in the past 2 days, where they published a new disclosure, which is called WIDA, Workforce Investment and Disclosure Act. Short of it, I think in the past 2 weeks, there was a new organization which was created. It's called Value Reporting Forum, VRF, with the merger of the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board and the IIRC, International Integrated Reporting Center. So the thing is that this is the future in which the direction the world is moving. And that direction is the sustainability in the world, how we are adding value to the planet. So in the larger framework, you see the ESG coming up, which is, I think, new to so many people, but the concept is not new, because we have to contribute toward the planet. So 30414 fits very strongly in the social framework, right? So I see the future very promising. Not necessarily in the name of 30414, because it promotes a principles, it promotes a concept. So somebody may not get certified, but I think people would still love to become more transparent in terms of their reporting and the disclosures. So I'm quite optimistic about the future. And now the level of optimism is far greater than almost when we started 10 years ago, and particularly when I started my company, because I know the same sentiments when I shared with somebody that I'm coming up with the HR metrics. So his first question was that, are you going to measure the human beings? It's not possible. I said, I'm not going to measure the human being. I would like to use the framework to measure the performance of the human being. So I think we have to follow that spirit, and I'm quite hopeful.
Well, that's a great example. And it's as I've said it in a couple, and it's certainly not my expression, but it's a journey, not a destination. But I think for people like yourself and others involved in this project, this past 12 months, as challenging as it has been for so many historic reasons, on the domain of human capital reporting, on the domain of ISO standards related to HR. It's not just human capital reporting. They've got diversity and inclusion has been published. There's so much in this ESG pipeline that you talk about, Zahid, that for people who take the opportunity to learn more, I think if they are constructive and positive in their mindset, they will see a profound opportunity here, which is extremely exciting. And it's not limited to HR, is it, Zahid? This is about people. And it just so happens that, HR is often seen as most aligned with the workforce. But, you and I both know this common statistic that's often referenced about the S&P value add over the past 40 years and how much is coming from intangible capital relative to the historic examples of tangible capital. And for people who, again, like yourself, like myself, who've been in this people space for a while, it's a recognition, I think, that we've always believed, but now we've got the evidence behind us, and we've got, like that expression, the wind in our sails. Is that fair comment?
Absolutely, absolutely. In a sense that that you see in the context of the information which is generated by the Tomo Ocean, United States. They do evaluation of the 500 Fortune companies. So the tangibles, which previously stood at 83% in 1975, now they stood at just 10%. So we cannot ignore. There's a huge opportunity over here. And also, I would like to second your compliment that it reinforces the concept of stakeholder capitalism. It's not just for the HR. You have the regulators, you have the community in which you're working, you have the main stakeholder that your employee. Unless your employees are not fully engaged, how your organization is going to move forward. So your line managers, your lawmakers, all these people, I think, are full stakeholders in this process. So in that context, it provides it's a very balanced framework to take care of the needs or the aspiration of everybody in the society. And as you said, this is nothing cast in stone. Going forward, you may come up with a fine version of it, but it's a good starting point for somebody who is optimistic about, being responsible in terms of, their contribution, and particularly how to demonstrate your contribution to the community.
Imagine if you're an Olympic athlete training and you don't measure your training, and yet your goal is to be successful, win a gold medal at the Olympics. You can't do it. And yet, for some reason, when we're put into our work environment, so many people think that you can achieve outcomes individually and collectively simply by being there. And I think that's one of the changes. So Zahid, we're right up sort of at our time limit. I want to thank you on behalf of myself, my colleague Fahad here in Dubai, and everyone in the Human Capital Management Impact Group for your contributions, for your time today, and just the general best of luck with your vision for what you're doing individually and for the group. Thank you.
So kind of you, Brad. I think you're doing a wonderful job as a part of the group. I think this is a great value to the community, to the overall the HR profession, that you're giving them a true picture about what is the HR. That's, I think, is important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zahid. Cheers from Dubai.